This is the Investor Connect podcast program. I'm Hall T. Martin. I'm the host of this show in which we interview angel investors, venture capital, family offices, private equity, and many other investors for early stage and growth companies. I hope you enjoy this episode. Well, hello, this is Hall Martin with Investor Connect. Today I'm here with Mike Smerklo, author of Mr. Monkey and Me. Mike, thank you for joining us again.
Hal, it's great to be here again. Thanks for having me.
Great. Last time we talked, we were discussing Next Coast Ventures, and that was back in 2018. This time I see you published a new book, Mr. Monkey and Me.
Yeah, it's been a really interesting experience. It's basically about the mental aspects of entrepreneurship. So a really interesting life experience, and hopefully it's being helping somebody out there.
Great. Well, I read the book and enjoyed it thoroughly. And I noticed you started with Know Thyself. And since you're an entrepreneur and help entrepreneurs, do you think that is the base foundation of successful entrepreneurship, is knowing yourself?
Yeah, the book was, I wrote the book, all proceeds for the book go to charity. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that. But I wrote the book basically because I didn't see content that was helpful for the average entrepreneur getting started or trying to get through the ups and downs. And it was based on dumb things and mistakes I made, the lessons that I saw other people doing, and now at Next Coast Ventures, having invested over 50 different companies, watching to see what patterns emerged in terms of successful entrepreneurs. I came into the job as I was an operator, as a venture capitalist. I thought there's got to be a few attributes that people do well. It turns out that I don't think there's a personality type that succeeds in entrepreneurship, but I think there's several mental characteristics. S is self-awareness, and I do think it is the foundation for entrepreneurship. I think it's probably the most important one, even though the formula is not a pyramid. It is probably the first and most important one for successful entrepreneurship.
And so what question do you pose to founders to assess their self-awareness, as that's a key element to being successful, it sounds like? Yeah,
it's a lot of, and this has changed, COVID has made it a little more challenging, but our typical process is looking at an opportunity, the solution, and then really trying to get one-on-one time with the entrepreneur to understand what makes her tick and how she's thinking about the business and what she wants to do with it. And usually somewhere along the more personal discussions about what, in this case, she wants to do with the business, you start to get a sense for how well they know themselves. Are they thinking about where their gaps are? And so questions around, where do you need help most on the team? Where's your risk? Where do you think this could fail? Simple questions like that tend to show more than tell me about how you're going to grow sales or what the market opportunity is.
Great. Well, you use the acronym SHAPE, SHAPE, to identify the different elements that go into that. And when I look at that, it seemed like that echoed the philosophy of the Stoics, which emphasizes self-awareness and self-control. Do you subscribe to the Stoic philosophy at some level?
I do. And I talk about a quote in there, which is a great Marcus Aurelius quote about just basically waking up, and it's part of the E expectations, because I think a lot of people come into entrepreneurship and think, this is great, and they see Shark Tank, and I get a great idea, and I'm going to raise lots of money, and then it'll all be easy. Or in my case, I always thought it someday would get easier. We get to this big, or we go public, that's all going to get easier. And the short reality is it never does. And the quote from the Stoic philosophy says, basically wake up every day and expect, in shorthand, get kicked in the head. And the more you embrace that and think about it, then you realize that your really locus of control is around your mental aspect and how you respond to things versus trying to change or make everything happen the way you think it should.
Well, you emphasize a lot in the entrepreneur's journey. How did you dig down to find your authenticity?
Well, candidly, it didn't come easily. I talk about this in the book. I mean, I grew up a poor kid from Toledo, Ohio. I didn't have the best pedigree education-wise, and I carried a lot of that baggage with me. And so I always had this feeling of like, am I really know what I'm doing as a CEO or as an entrepreneur? And I think the early years of my time there, I looked to role models. I tell the story. I had two really interesting role models. I was fortunate to work for a guy named Ben Horowitz for a couple of years, a legendary entrepreneur, now one of the main partners at Andreessen Horowitz in Silicon Valley. And I also had another very important mentor who was very kind of sales-driven alpha male. And I found myself kind of going between the two of them. And it was only really a couple of years in, and probably don't have time to tell the whole story, but it's in the book, where I just found myself struggling. I felt exhausted. I'm not really showing up the way I should. I'm not being vulnerable as a leader. And I think it's holding me back and holding my team back. And I don't know if I ever mastered authenticity, but when I started to become more aware of that, and I got a coach to help me with it, I watched my leadership team start to flourish and candidly, the business start to grow even faster.
Right. Well, in the book, you talk about for every founder, there's some parts of the startup that they fit well and it's comfortable, and other parts they don't fit well and it's uncomfortable. Where did you find the most comfortable fit in a startup?
Yeah, and I see, and it's a really important point. It kind of goes back to that S in the shape is knowing where you're good at. And to me, I love engagement. I love meeting customers. So all of my biggest comfort zone was on sales and marketing and customer engagement. I think I also really enjoyed the employee communications and motivating teams. Those are things I was really good at and I enjoyed. There were some things that I enjoyed, but I probably wasn't really good at. And then there was things that I just really wasn't good at. And that's where you got to go, okay, I got to get some help in here to supplement or make up for those weaknesses or shortcomings.
Well, you also talked about finding the right goals. And how did you find the right goals in your journey?
Well, I think it's still going, Hal. I don't know if I've ever been able to really do that. What I found, a couple of different things. I found two very different aspects. One, small incremental goals tend to get you going. And it's something I use every day in my life, whether it's be a daily goal, a weekly goal. And I'm not talking about self-improvement goals, but just what are you trying to accomplish? Breaking that down into small steps and then using that to create momentum. And I'm a big believer that momentum is a massively underrated and incredibly important, powerful part of any part of life, but certainly entrepreneurship. And then the other thing I began to realize over time is I'd set these goals for accomplishment and wealth accumulation and company size. And for a while, I thought that once I achieved those or got to those levels, this inner voice, which is the real star of the book, Mr. Monkey, would go away. And then I would suddenly wake up in a nirvana state of self-acceptance and self-congratulatory mode. And what in reality happened is every time I hit one of those goals, it never went away. I set higher ones. And so I was on that hedonistic treadmill, if you will, of just trying to get more. And it never got satisfied. And I finally started to come to grips that that's an inner voice in my head, Mr. Monkey. He's telling me that I'm never going to be good enough. And so the biggest thing was starting to realize that voice was there and then trying to address it versus trying to achieve one more goal.
Okay. Well, so what was the best thing you did to prepare for your entrepreneurial journey? Well, it's a long journey. And when you look back on your experience, what was the best thing you did to get ready for it?
Well, I had this goal coming out of business school, and I said, I want to run a company someday. And as one of my mentors joked as well, the only problem I had is I didn't have a really good idea to do it, but I wanted to do it. I just had it in my burning in my core to go do it. The best thing I did was go work for two really great, accomplished entrepreneurs. And I see this a lot of times with entrepreneurs where they feel like if they're not taking the time to go learn the trade, if you will, they are wasting their time. So the best thing I did was I had read all about entrepreneurship and all these different things. And then I went to work for Ben Horowitz and Mark Andreessen. And it was literally like kind of thinking about running a marathon and then going to Kenya and training with, sub 2-hour marathon runners. Like, holy cow, this is the real deal. This is how the pace, the chaos of what it means to be an entrepreneur. And I learned more in my 2 years there than I even realized. And so I think there was something for me to go and see it firsthand, have great role models, figure out what I thought I'd be good at and what I would do differently. And that set me on my journey.
So what percent of entrepreneurship is mental toughness, just being ready for it mentally?
Well, I'd be really careful with this because the book is about mental tenacity and toughness, but I also say, hey, don't fool yourself. You have to have a pretty big market to go after. You have to have an innovative solution that customers want. And you got to focus on building that and repeating it. So that said, if you have two companies with exact same of all of that stuff and access to resources, I think mental toughness is almost always the difference between success and failure. Every category that we look at Next Coast Ventures, there's 10 companies trying to do the same thing, at least. Mm-hmm. They have the same access to resources, similar business plans or solution sets. The ones who win, in our experience, tend to be the ones who have that mental edge, who can get through the ups and downs, who can think about how they build their team, get the right help, and really drive the business forward. So I think all things being equal, it is the number one criteria between success and failure.
Well, you referenced it in the book, but there are many peer mentorship groups out there, such as YPO and others. How did you get the most out of the time you spent in those groups? What did you do that led to making that an effective effort?
It's a great question, Hal. What it really taught me, and I'm still in my YPO chapter, it really taught me many things, but one, it was just being around peers. And then when you're around peers trying to run growing businesses, you quickly realize, gosh, we all are struggling with a lot of the same issues. We all don't know everything. And then what it really taught me, though, was the power of vulnerability. And the more that I could sit down with peers and say, gosh, I'm struggling with XYZ. And sometimes XYZ wasn't, should we expand internationally? It's like, hey, I'm not sure I'm being a good dad, or I'm not getting enough time with my wife. Like, how do you all handle that? So that level of vulnerability and curiosity, having peers say, okay, well, here's what I did, or here's how I do that. Here, I have a date night, or whatever the example is, then getting real specific things that you can bring back to your life. So a lot of those peer groups to me were, rarely are they, even today, rarely is it, should we go do X, Y, and Z business-wise? It's more about how you show up as a human and how you can get better and think about the world a bit differently.
Great. Have you ever had a professional coach? And if so, what was the most surprising benefit you got from it?
Yeah, it's funny. I tell a story in the book about one of the lowest moments in my entrepreneurial journey. I had literally hired and fired 4 head of sales in like a 4-year period. And my board didn't say this, but it was pretty clear that if number 5 didn't work out, it was going to be me that went, not the head of sales. And so I went to see a legendary Silicon Valley leader and coach, a guy named Bill Campbell. He's no longer with us, but he's coached everyone from Steve Jobs to Tim Cook at Apple to the founders of Google. So literally just that guy, a really wonderful human being. I sit down and have a beer with them, and I'm exhausted. Smerklo, you look like hell. What's going on? And I tell him what's going on, and he says, well, who's your coach? I said, I don't have time for a coach. I'm trying to fire a head of sales. He's like, Tiger Woods has a coach. Steve Jobs has a coach. Why the hell, heck, but he was a very crunchy guy, but he said, why the heck don't you have a coach? And so it was a light bulb moment for me to really start thinking differently about getting professional help. For the rest of my time as a CEO, and even now I use most of my YPO resources to have a coach. So I've had a coach for the last 15 years. I've gotten so much out of that. Everything from specific things like, how do I run a team meeting? How do I think I'm showing up to my team versus how I am showing up to my team? How do I be more vulnerable? How to be more aware of what's happening? All of those things and many, many more. But I would say self-awareness has probably come most through my coaches.
Great. Well, you talked a moment ago about working at LoudCloud and how there's a lot of energy and it was the real deal. What was it like to work at LoudCloud as far as what did you take away from that was maybe not what you expected, or what was really the reality piece of working in a high growth, high velocity VC firm?
I'd come into the job from the sidelines. I'd been a financial advisor, investment banker, and an accountant to start my career. So I kind of had the outside looking in. What was it like? What I had no idea when I got in was just, and I say chaos, of just the pace and every day feeling like we're going to go out of business. When you watch it from an investment banking perspective, or if you watch Shark Tank, you think, well, look, they came up with a great idea and they went and did it, and now they're millionaires. The reality is it's like being on a roller coaster ride that never stops going 130 miles an hour. And I think so the first part for me was just that realization that the chaos never goes away. And then secondly, I learned a lot about culture from Ben Horowitz. He had this great thing. I'll never forget. I was one of the early non-founders, and Ben said to me, the first 30 to 40 employees are all that matter. And I looked at him, and we were trying to scale the business massively. I'm like, how could that be? How can it only be 30 and 40 employees? He said, it doesn't mean that number 41 is important, but the culture will be determined by the first 30 or so employees. Because I'll interview, Ben and Mark interviewed me. We'll interview the first cohort, then you'll go interview. And by the time we get past that, the culture will be established. And to me, that was one of those, never expected to learn that. Took that into my own entrepreneurial journey and thought so incredibly hard about the first key hires, and then how you establish a culture, and then how that culture has to scale when the business gets to hundreds and thousands of employees.
Right. So you referenced Ben Horowitz's book and the Mr. Monkey and Me. What did you find most insightful from the book since you worked with him?
Well, one, Ben is a legendary storyteller. When I wrote Mr. Monkey and Me, I thought if it could be like a third of his, or 1/10 as good as Ben's book, then I would have achieved something. So he's a great storyteller. Two, it was accurate because I lived the first 7 chapters. But I think Ben does a really good job of crystallizing again, to this uncertainty moment. But he calls it in his book, the wake up at 3 a.m. in literally a cold sweat, looking at almost no options. And why that's important for me, Hal, is I just think I don't want to discourage people from being entrepreneurs, but I do want them to realize, and there's a great quote from Elon Musk, which I loved from his Clubhouse thing a couple of days ago, where he said, being an entrepreneur is like eating glass. And we use that term in Mexico. So I was like, oh my gosh, Elon's using our terminology. It's a pretty common terminology, but it really speaks to just knowing that you're going to go through dramatic ups and downs. And I go back to the marathon thing. If a friend said to you, hey, I want to go run a marathon, you wouldn't say, oh, good luck, it should be fun. You'd say, no, you're going to train and your body's going to change and it's going to be exhausting. So I just want to give people that attributes of entrepreneurship. And I think Ben probably does it better than anybody.
Great. And so in general, who are your role models and why?
My role models in professional role models, I have massive admiration for, I'd pick like a guy I've never met before, but Phil Knight. And there's another great book, Shoe Dog, about the longitudinal view of building a company. My role models are people that have gone through the journey for a long period of time. They stayed the course and they've maintained some form of ethics and values. And so when I look to leaders or folks like that, I look at, there's a lot of really, the press likes to highlight all the bad stuff that happens, but there's a lot of great leaders that build great companies, do it over a long period of time, have a balance between their family, and end up, being good humans. So I don't know if I have a pretty long list of folks that fall in that category, and those are the folks I look to when I'm trying to figure out what to do.
Well, in the book, you mentioned, an interesting exercise, which is to ask someone to talk you out of something you're not sure about. Why do you think that's effective?
Yeah, it gets to that view again of the Pollyannish, this is going to be easy. To start an enterprise and grow it, it's going to be the hardest thing you do. And so if you don't have conviction, it doesn't mean about the idea, because the idea may change, but if you don't have conviction, if you aren't just a little bit crazy about your commitment levels, then you're probably going to fail. And so my recommendation that I talk about in the book is go ask 3 or 4 people that you really respect and tell them your idea and see if they can talk you out of it. And if you start to waver, then maybe the idea is not that great, or maybe your passion isn't where it is. Because I found in my own, when I was in the heat of it, the more I got told no, which was a lot, and that is going to happen a lot to any entrepreneur, I just got more mad. Like I used to keep this stupid yellow sticky on my desk of all the people I was going to prove wrong. That's a little bit of a dark side of my inner motivation, but I think understanding that's kind of the level of you need to have intensity you have to pursue your dream through all the ups and downs.
Good deal. So I like the SHAPE formula. I think it's a great concept. What's the next step for it? Where do you plan to take it?
Well, I wrote the book just to try and help entrepreneurs, and I felt it was a gap in content. There's too much short form content. The 10 things that Jeff Bezos does before 5 a.m. He's the second or first wealthiest person in the world given on the day. Like that doesn't really help the average entrepreneur. And there's a bunch of content out there around business plans, which is helpful, but it doesn't talk to about the day in, day outs of entrepreneurship. So that's why I wrote the book. I've been promoting it. As part of my day job is quite busy co-managing a venture capital firm in Austin, Texas. But I've really been promoting it mostly because A, I hope it helps, and B, every dollar of proceeds goes to a scholarship my wife and I set up for underrepresented and diverse students interested in entrepreneurship. And so I'm out here trying to get people to buy the book. 1, I hope it helps, but 2, every dollar of proceeds goes to help a student who needs it.
Well, it's good to know. Well, in the last few minutes that we have here, what else should we cover that we haven't?
Well, the only thing else I'd bring out is that there is a website under my name, mikesmerklo.com. That's my handle, all the social outlets. At the website, I would encourage people who are interested in entrepreneurship to go check it out. It has a free quiz that'll help you think about being entrepreneurship and the readiness for it. It's got some blog pieces about what I'm passionate about, the mental aspect of entrepreneurship, and a free chapter of the book. So people check it out. That would be great. I'd also highlight the book's available on Amazon.com. And Next Coast Ventures in Austin, Texas, super active, looking for great entrepreneurs. We've got all our themes that we invest in. That's on our website at Next Coast Ventures. So I sound a little bit like an advertiser or one of those high-speed commercials. But Next Coast Ventures, we're always looking for the next amazing cohort of entrepreneurs. So if you got something, please contact us.
Great. So based on those two websites, which is the best way for listeners to get back in touch with you?
Probably the MikeSmerklo.com for information on Mr. Monkey and me and about the mental aspects of entrepreneurship. That's probably the most content rich about what we've talked about.
Great. Well, we'll put those in the show notes. I want to thank you for joining us today and hope to have you back for a follow-up soon.
Thanks, Hal. Always enjoyed it. Really appreciate you taking the time.
Investor Connect helps investors interested in startup funding. In this podcast series, experienced investors share their experience and advice. You can learn more at investorconnect.org.
Hal T. Martin is the director of Investor Connect, which is a 501c3 nonprofit dedicated to the education of investors for early-stage funding. All opinions expressed by Hal in podcast guests are solely their own opinions and do not reflect the opinions of Investor Connect. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be relied upon for the basis of investment decisions.